The evolution of technology is changing the way we live in many ways, including the means and manner of our media consumption. Podcasting is one of those sectors that is growing, even in Africa, and it's giving content creators opportunities and freedom to get their voices heard. The scene is also mostly led by women, as DW's Edith Kimani reports from Nairobi, Kenya.
A fundamental of great sex for me is freedom to be super loud.
Lydia KM and Murugi Muni may have unfiltered conversations, but the podcast stars carefully curate their image. They've just wrapped up creating content which will be released over the coming month for their podcast, The Messy In Between, or TMI. Recently, they've been named one of Africa's top shows. They say they're offering something new for an African audience, talking about their lives in a fresh and uninhibited way.
There are some people who will still be like, you young girls should not be talking about this. You're corrupting the youth or something. Then the others were like, wow, thank you for talking about this. Thank you for sharing some of these things that, other women are going through. I thought I was alone. I'm also going through it. And for us, I feel like those people, that second group, they are what keep us going.
TMI discusses sensitive and taboo topics in a bantering, relaxed style.
Because no one is applauding a woman for being a mom to a kid that she gave birth to. Yeah. But people are applauding.
It's an intimate way of talking that has endeared them to a loyal fan base.
We like to create unfiltered. And that's what we were doing on our own individual pages, like authentically creating and sharing our journeys in a very vulnerable and open way. So we wanted TMI to be that, but now in like a stronger concentration and more focus on the struggles women have.
Across the city, Adele Onyango and her team are getting a booth ready to take her new media company, Legally Clueless Africa, to a large beauty exhibit. She started a personal podcast 5 years ago. Now she runs a fully fledged media enterprise offering training to budding podcasters.
What I did is come up with a curriculum to digital curriculum to coach Africans on how can they make sustainable content that then leads them to being new media practitioners. And also we've had our own in-house masterclasses on podcasting, teaching about the business angle, because a big part of sustainability is not only the content, but also how do we make sure you're making adequate revenue.
Seeing women make that revenue and keeping it is something close to Melissa Mbugwa's heart. She works for Africa Podfest, which supports podcasters in a range of different ways.
We can see this future, this potential, but if we don't step in and talk about the money, talk about how we're going to actually create business models out of this, how we're going to make sure that the money flows in a way that centers us, the historically marginalized, then it's going to pass by us. It's going to pass, and other people will kind of take it over if they don't come and find us.
Back at the studio, Lydia and Murugi wrapped the day's shoot. With over 1 million plays across various platforms, their podcast is now able to do what most cannot: pay them.
Let's speak now to Josephine Karianjahi, co-founder of Africa Podfest. Hi, Joe, and we also had your colleague in that report, Melissa, co-founder as well. And in that report, just talking there about how podcasts have created careers for people in Kenya. You've been studying the continent and the trends with podcasts. What makes for a good podcast?
Well, thank you for having me. So one of the things about a great African podcast is that it is created with the African audience in mind. So a great podcast knows exactly where it's being listened to. So you've already got the ideal listener in mind, whether they're sitting in traffic in Nairobi, or they have a business in Accra, or they are somebody who's in a position of leadership in Lagos. Wherever they are, you know exactly how long they are going to listen to the podcast and why they're listening. So you've got to grab their attention in the first 20 seconds. If you don't have their attention, you've got to start again. It's a great podcast, one, because it responds to the language of the person who's listening to that podcast. And of course, it is rooted in the things that people love about Africa: great storytelling, great accounts, great personalities. And that's what I think would make a really good podcast.
What trends are you seeing around podcasts, both in terms of the way they're made, but also in terms of the way they're consumed?
So at Africa Podfest, we started looking at what people are thinking and consuming from a perspective of asking people, what would you like your your favorite podcasters to talk about? And we found that people want to hear stories about what's happening in their country, what's happening in their neighborhood, what's happening in their industry. And a lot of people really enjoy listening to pop culture podcasts. They like listening to stories that don't necessarily get airtime on their national stations. They want to hear about topics that are whispered in many contexts. And it could be everything from how much money do you earn to what are the latest trends to what's going to be happening in 2024. So a lot of people who responded to our survey as Africa Podfest were really identifying that they want to see themselves in their podcast. They want to hear themselves. And then in reverse, we heard from the podcasters saying, great, we love this data. We're going to take it and we're going to amplify the work that we're doing. And so you find that the top podcasts across the continent respond to people's need to really have authoritative voices that really speak their language and understand their context.
But because podcasting is accessible, the whole scene is democratized in a way, has led people to even say that possibly there are too many podcasts because of the kind of content. Do you think this freedom and this unfiltered nature can become a problem?
Well, I mean, we launched Africa Podcast Day to be on February 12th of every year. And every year we've heard from people saying, I still haven't had a podcast like the one I want to create. And so there are lots of interview style podcasts like this particular interview. There's lots of people who are going into niche areas. There's a huge growth in spirituality and religion podcasts of all natures. There are also multilingual podcasts growing across the continent, and that's really exciting.
These are generally around individuals, and then you say communities, so sort of this organic ground level. But how can sort of the bigger fish, the corporates, the NGOs, the governments get involved and attract this same kind of audience and get involved in that conversation the same way?
So I think I would really like people who have a currency to invest in podcasts to remember this. It is a great way of reaching your whole audience. And we've seen this happen. We've seen heads of state, go to podcasts to have their, audiences reached. We've seen that a lot of the audiences that are growing across Africa are Gen Z. They are, the fastest growing demographic across Africa. So, as a person who is creating content, building around a message, if you have stories that you need told, you have to be involved in audio. We've seen people build around the concept of the way that audio is portable and creating really light content that can be transferred using social apps that can be transferred, even using a flash disk that's taken by a motorbike to the next audience. We've seen that happen, and we've seen audiences really respond to that and say, thank you for reaching me where I am. So anyone who's got a moment to think about where to put their advertising, where to put their people, podcasting is growing across Africa thanks to podcasters who've been doing it in its original form, using narrative podcasts, people who are award-winning globally. And so there are experts from across the African podcast space who are making this contextually available. If you open up our website, so podcasting.africa, you'll find some of them. If you go into many parts of Africa, you will find a podcast producer producing great content. We are excited that this is going to become a big part of what's happening across Africa, but people need to be informed, get knowledgeable. There's lots of free resources if you know just where to click. So it is an opportunity. I think people should take advantage of the fact that African producers are leading this charge, and African markets are ready for that.
Okay, we'll look forward to seeing how the scene develops. Josephine Karianjahi of Africa Podfest, thank you for your insights.
Thank you.